I was 42 miles away buying feed when my son called and said, "Dad, I think the HOA is cutting down the tree line." At first, I honestly thought he meant a branch or two. Maybe somebody had hired a trimming crew and crossed a property marker by accident. That kind of thing happens in rural communities. Then he said, "No, Dad, they're dropping the whole thing." I remember standing there in the parking lot with a pallet of feed supplements behind me, staring across a sea of pickup trucks while the words slowly settled into my brain. The whole thing. The entire tree line. The windbreak my grandfather planted after World War II. The windbreak that had stood there longer than most of the houses in the county. The windbreak that marked the western edge of our family farm and held back winter storms for nearly 80 years. I asked him how many trees were down. There was a pause. Then he said, "At least 40. My stomach dropped. "Call the sheriff," I told him. "Call your mother. And get your grandfather inside." Then I got in my truck and drove faster than I've driven in 20 years. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 56 years old, and my family has farmed the same stretch of land outside Cedar Ridge, Minnesota, for 4 generations. My grandfather, Walter Mercer, came home from the Pacific in 1946 carrying more scars than stories. He bought 130 acres with a veteran's loan and spent his first spring planting 60 trees along the western property line before he even started building the farmhouse. He used to say a man who planned to stay should plant something he'd never live long enough to see fully grown. Those trees became our windbreak. Black walnut, white oak, pine. They stood through blizzards, droughts, hailstorms, and every economic disaster farming could throw at us. My father loved them. My brother loved them. Hell, everybody in the family loved them. My older brother Caleb especially. He died when he was 19 after a combined accident in a soybean field south of the windbreak. There is a particular white oak near the northern end where he used to sit every summer with a paperback novel and a fishing rod. After he died, nobody in the family ever referred to that tree by its species again. We just called it Caleb's tree. Years later, when a luxury subdivision appeared beyond the western property line, those trees suddenly became a problem for somebody else. The development was called Lake Horizon Estates. Expensive homes, big windows, bigger egos. Most of the residents were decent people. A few weren't. The worst among them was a woman named Vanessa Holloway. Vanessa became HOA president shortly after moving in. She had the kind of confidence people mistake for intelligence. Every conversation with her felt like being politely threatened. She dressed like she was running for governor and spoke like everybody else was lucky to be hearing her opinions. The first time she introduced herself, she smiled and said, "Those trees are beautiful. Such a shame they block the lake." I remember laughing because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Over the next decade, she launched one campaign after another trying to get rid of the windbreak. She offered money. She sent letters. She filed complaints. She petitioned the county. Every attempt failed because the trees were entirely on our property and fully protected under agricultural zoning regulations. Most people would have accepted defeat. Vanessa treated defeat like a temporary inconvenience. Every year, she came back with a new idea. Every year she lost. Looking back, I should have realized obsession was replacing common sense. But when you spend your life farming, you learn that some storms never arrive no matter how dark the clouds look. I thought Vanessa was just another storm that would pass. I was wrong. When I finally turned into our gravel driveway that afternoon, the first thing I noticed was silence. The birds were gone. The shade was gone. The familiar wall of trees stretching along the western edge of the property was gone. In its place stood 60 fresh stumps and mountains of sawdust. I parked the truck and just sat there for a moment. It felt like arriving at a funeral after everyone had already left. The smell hit me next. Fresh oak, fresh pine, fresh walnut. The scent of living things that had been alive that morning and were now lying in pieces. My son Wyatt was waiting near the machine shed. He didn't say anything when I got out. He just pointed toward the property line. 6 men with logging equipment were securing the final load onto a trailer. Their foreman looked sick. Beyond them, up on a deck overlooking the lake, Vanessa Holloway stood holding a glass of white wine. Even from 400 yards away, I could see her smiling. And in that moment, standing among the stumps my grandfather had planted and my brother had grown up beside, I realized this wasn't a mistake. Somebody had done exactly what they intended to do, and they thought they had won. The foreman's name was Grant Miller, and I'd known him for almost 20 years. Grant wasn't the kind of man who cut corners. He wasn't careless. He wasn't reckless. The moment he saw me walking toward him, he removed his hard hat and looked like a man who already knew his career was about to become part of a criminal investigation. "Ethan," he said quietly, "before you say anything, I need you to know I was lied to." I stopped a few feet away. "Start talking." He handed me a folder. Inside was a property survey showing the tree line, supposedly sitting inside HOA-controlled land. There is also an easement agreement dated 16 years earlier with what appeared to be my father's signature. "Vanessa's husband gave us these documents," Grant explained. "They said the trees were subject to an easement agreement and that the owners had already been notified." I looked at the signature. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was insulting. My father's signature looked nothing like that. "You believe this?" I asked. Grant rubbed the back of his neck. "At first, yes. Then around midday, something started bothering me. The measurements didn't match older county maps. I called Vanessa and told her I wanted confirmation before continuing. She drove down herself. And she said everything was legal. She told me to finish the job. I stared at him for a long moment. "How many trees were left when you called?" Grant lowered his eyes. 19. For a second, I wanted somebody to blame. Anybody. But looking at Grant standing there, I realized he looked worse than I felt. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew he'd been used. "Don't move another log," I said. "Nothing leaves this property until the sheriff signs off." "Already stopped loading," he replied. "And Ethan, I'll testify." That was the first moment I realized Vanessa might have created a bigger problem than she understood. The sheriff arrived 40 minutes later. Sheriff Nolan Briggs had known my family since high school. He walked the property slowly, photographing every stump and every tire track while 2 deputies documented equipment locations. Then he asked me a question. "Did you authorize any of this?" "No." "Did your father?" "No." "Did anyone from the HOA ever receive permission?" "Never." He nodded once and looked across the property toward the subdivision. "Then we've got a problem." The next few hours unfolded like something from a legal drama nobody wanted to star in. My father came outside and stood beside the empty field where the windbreak had once stood. He was 82 years old by then. Age had taken some of his strength, but none of his memory. He stared at the stumps for a long time before speaking. "Your grandfather planted every one of those by hand." "I know. Don't let them think they got away with it." It wasn't anger in his voice. Somehow that made it hit harder. Anger passes. Disappointment stays. That evening the sheriff interviewed Vanessa. The following morning he returned with news. She admitted authorizing the removal. I nearly dropped my coffee. She admitted it, said she believed the easement gave her authority. And the survey claims it's legitimate. I laughed again. Then she's either lying or the dumbest HOA president in Minnesota. The sheriff smiled slightly. Possibly both. Things moved quickly after that. My attorney, Rachel Bennett, started digging into the paperwork. Within 48 hours, she discovered something fascinating. The easement agreement had never been signed by my father. The signature had been forged. Worse, the original filing records showed Vanessa's husband, Martin Holloway, personally submitted the document years earlier. Then Rachel found another thread and started pulling. Martin owned a consulting company that had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from the HOA over the previous decade. Landscaping reviews, property management studies, environmental consulting. The descriptions sounded impressive until investigators realized the company had never actually performed most of the services. Money went in, money came out, straight into personal accounts. Suddenly, this wasn't just about trees anymore. It was fraud, real fraud, criminal fraud, federal fraud. Every day brought another ugly surprise. State forestry officials evaluated the losses and assigned a value to the destroyed trees. The total exceeded $150,000. Under state law, wrongful timber removal could trigger triple damages. Then conservation officials discovered part of the windbreak had been enrolled in a federal conservation program that introduced another layer of potential penalties. By the end of the week, investigators from 3 separate agencies were involved. Vanessa spent 11 years trying to get rid of those trees. In 6 days, she managed to attract the attention of people whose business cards contained the words criminal investigation. One evening, Rachel called me while I was sitting on the porch. "How quickly can you get permits for a grain storage structure?" she asked. I smiled. "Pretty quickly." "Good. Why?" "Because I've been reviewing zoning maps." I already knew where the conversation was headed. "Rachel, hear me out. I know exactly where this is going." "Then tell me." I looked toward the subdivision. Without the windbreak, dozens of homes now enjoyed a perfect lake view. "You found a legal location on my property line." "The most legal location imaginable." "How tall?" There was a pause. 100 feet. I leaned back in my chair and laughed harder than I had in weeks. Not because it was revenge. Not exactly. Because it was completely legal. Every permit, every regulation, every agricultural protection statute. Perfectly legal. The next morning we filed the paperwork. The permit sailed through approval because it met every requirement. Grain storage was a legitimate agricultural use. Our operation genuinely needed additional storage capacity. The structure complied with setbacks. The county signed off without hesitation. Word spread through Lake Horizon Estates like a grass fire. Vanessa appeared in my driveway 3 days later with 3 HOA board members trailing behind her. She climbed my porch steps carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." My father was sitting nearby. My son stood behind me. My wife watched through the kitchen window. "What misunderstanding?" I asked. "The tree removal was conducted under authority granted by a recorded easement." She opened a folder and presented the forged document like a magician revealing a card trick. I didn't even look at it. "My father didn't sign that." "That remains to be determined." "No," I said. "It doesn't." For the first time, her smile flickered. I took a sip of coffee. "State investigators are already examining the original filing." Her face tightened. "Well, these matters can take years to resolve." "Maybe. And legal disputes can become very expensive." "Also true." She seemed encouraged by that. Then I added, "Fortunately, criminal investigations move faster." That wiped the smile away completely. She stared at me for several seconds before changing the subject. "I understand you've applied for a grain silo permit." "I have." "Surely that's unnecessary." "Actually, it's extremely necessary. 100 feet seems excessive." "You know what else seems excessive?" I asked. "Cutting down 60 trees because you wanted a better lake view." Nobody said a word. Even the board members looked uncomfortable. Vanessa gathered her folder and tried one last smile. It didn't work. As she walked back toward her SUV, my father finally spoke. He hadn't said a single word during the entire conversation. "Build it," he said. "I plan to. Make it tall." Watching Vanessa stop for half a second before continuing toward her vehicle was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. What none of us knew yet was that the silo itself was about to become the least of her problems. The permit was approved 4 days later. The concrete contractor arrived the following week. Bright orange survey stakes appeared along the western edge of my property, exactly where the old windbreak had once stood. Every morning, I'd step onto the porch with a cup of coffee and see residents from Lake Horizon Estates standing in their backyards staring at those stakes like they were watching a slow-motion natural disaster unfold. The funny thing was, nobody could stop it. The project complied with every zoning regulation, every agricultural code requirement, every county ordinance. The same laws Vanessa had spent years trying to work around were now protecting me. By the time the foundation was poured, the criminal investigation had already expanded beyond the tree cutting. State investigators confirmed the easement signature was fraudulent. Financial records linked Martin Holloway's consulting company to years of questionable HOA payments. Several board members suddenly started cooperating with investigators. Amazing how quickly loyalty disappears when subpoenas arrive. Meanwhile, construction continued. The first truck carrying galvanized steel panels rolled onto the farm just before sunrise on a Monday morning. My son Wyatt stood beside me watching workers unload everything. "Think they're panicking over there yet?" he asked, nodding toward the subdivision. "Probably." "Good." I shouldn't have laughed, but I did. The structure rose fast. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. Every day it grew higher. Every day more curtains twitched inside expensive homes overlooking the property line. By the end of the second week, the silo towered above everything around it, shining silver under the morning sun. The view from Lake Horizon Estates had changed permanently. The lake was still there, technically. It was just hiding behind 100 feet of agricultural reality. Vanessa completely lost her mind. First, she filed a lawsuit claiming the silo was a spite structure designed solely to interfere with property values. Rachel almost laughed when she read it. "This thing won't survive 5 minutes in court," she told me. "The silo serves a legitimate agricultural purpose. You have harvest projections proving you need the storage. The lawsuit is nonsense." She was right. But Vanessa wasn't finished embarrassing herself. About 2 weeks later, one of my security cameras sent an alert to my phone during dinner. I opened a video feed and nearly choked on my mashed potatoes. There was Vanessa standing at the base of the silo with a can of red spray paint. She looked around, shook the can, and painted 2 giant words across the steel panels. "Ugly spite." Then she stepped back to admire her work like Michelangelo finishing the Sistine Chapel. The problem was she had done it directly in front of 4 high-definition cameras. I showed the footage to Wyatt. He stared for 3 seconds before saying, "No way." Way. Did she seriously just vandalize evidence while already under investigation? Apparently. Sheriff Daniels arrived 20 minutes later. When he watched the footage, he laughed so hard he had to remove his glasses. Then he arrested her. That was the moment the entire story exploded beyond our county. Local newspapers picked it up first, then regional outlets, then national agricultural publications. Reporters started calling. I declined every interview. The facts were already doing enough talking. The criminal trials began several months later. I never spent much time in courtrooms before. Farmers generally prefer tractors to legal proceedings. But sitting there watching evidence pile up against Vanessa and Martin felt surreal. The forged documents, the financial records, the testimony from contractors, the conservation reports, the tree valuations. Every piece fit together like a puzzle investigators had already solved before the trial even started. When it was my turn to testify, the prosecutor asked about the windbreak. I talked about my grandfather planting those trees after returning from the war. I talked about my father helping care for them. I talked about my brother Caleb sitting beneath that old white oak with paperback novels every summer before he died. Somewhere in the middle of that testimony, I had to stop for a second. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, because I could suddenly see that tree in my head exactly the way it used to look. Tom does that. It hides memories until somebody asks the right question. The defense attorney tried suggesting the trees had limited value. That didn't go well. Then he tried suggesting the silo was merely an act of revenge. That went even worse. "Sir," I said, "the silo increased our storage capacity enough to improve annual grain marketing revenue significantly. It will pay for itself." Several jurors nodded. One even smiled. The verdict came faster than anyone expected. Vanessa was convicted. Martin eventually accepted a plea agreement on multiple fraud-related charges. Civil judgments followed. Financial penalties followed. The HOA underwent leadership changes. New board members took over. Most residents simply wanted the nightmare to end. What surprised me most happened afterward. One afternoon, a group of homeowners from the subdivision asked if they could come speak with us. I agreed. About a dozen people showed up carrying folding chairs and homemade desserts. They sat in the yard and apologized. Not because they had cut the trees down. Most of them hadn't even known what was happening. They apologized because they'd spent years allowing one person to bully everyone around her. That conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. It turned out we had more in common than differences. Funny how that works once the loudest person in the room stops talking. The settlement money eventually arrived. By then I had already made my decision. I didn't want the money for myself. Instead, our family created a conservation fund dedicated to restoring damaged windbreaks across rural communities. The first project was our own farm. We replanted 60 new trees along the exact same property line. Same spacing, same layout, same vision my grandfather had carried nearly 80 years earlier. The third tree from the north end was dedicated to Caleb. My father stood beside me the day we planted it. He passed away 2 years later. A few weeks before his death, he looked out the window toward the young trees and asked, "They coming back all right?" I told him they were. He smiled and said, "Good." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me about the windbreak. Today the trees are growing. The silo is still standing. It's full of grain most years and earning its keep exactly as intended. The families living in Lake Horizon Estates still see it every morning when they look toward the lake. Most of them wave when they drive by now. And honestly, if you ask me whether building the silo was revenge, I still don't know how to answer. Part of me says no. It was a legitimate agricultural investment. Another part of me remembers Vanessa smiling over 60 fresh stumps and thinks maybe the timing wasn't entirely accidental. So I'll leave that question to you. Was the silo justice, revenge, or something in between? Drop your opinion in the comments because I genuinely want to hear where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who thought they could push you around simply because they had money or power, tell us your story below. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you subscribe because next week's case involves an HOA board member who tried to seize a retired veteran's truck and somehow ended up facing federal investigators. Trust me, that story is every bit as unbelievable as this one. I'll see you in the next one.